Now, someone asked the question that what does God's timing actually means? And if God's timing is always best, then what is the difference between God's timing and how life in reality naturally unfolds? Hi guys, success here, correcting biblical misconception. Now let's dive in. Now let me admit and agree that truly, sometimes as Christians, we use this word, God's timing is the best. We use it in a vague or unhelpful manner. That means it's not really necessary when we use those words. Sometimes we even use it when we are facing the consequence of our own choices or action, and we just say God's timing is the best. So yes, sometimes as Christians we misuse the word, but it doesn't mean that we are always wrong why we use it. But sometimes we misuse it. Now, when we talk about God's timing, what does God's timing simply means? Drop your answers in the comment section. Biblically, God's timing simply means that God works out his purposes according to his wisdom and his own schedule, not ours. I don't know if you understand. When we're saying God's timing, it just simply means that God is working out his purposes, or he will work out that purpose according to his own schedule and not the one that we have in our mind, according to his own word schedule, according to his own time frame. That is what it means biblically as God's timing, meaning God is doing that thing, or we do that thing when it is his timing, when it is his schedule for that thing to happen here on earth. Do you understand? So what I'm just trying to say in a nutshell, that when we talk about God's timing, we're talking about God's own schedule, God's own timetable for that his purpose towards become a reality. Now, that aside, when we talk about God's timing and life naturally unfolding, now you need to understand that there is a nuance. Sometimes it can be that God is working through the natural process of life unfolding by itself to achieve his purpose. Why sometimes it's not God's timing? It could be that we are actually facing the consequence of our choices. I've explained before in one of my videos that if we, the moment humans begin to understand that every choice that you make, physically with your bare eye, you are seeing the choice, but what you are not seeing is the consequence attached to that choice. The consequence could be either good or bad, depending on the choice. So for every choice, it's just like you are drawing a rope. You are dragging a rope, rather. You are dragging a rope towards your end. For every choice you are dragging towards your end, for every choice you make, there is a consequence simultaneously, meaning at the same time you are dragging with it. Now, the consequence now may happen immediately or might be later, but just know that for you making that choice, there is a consequence that has been attached to it. It can be either of good or bad. So sometimes, once we as Christians or as humans say, God's timing, it could be that it is a consequence from your own word, from your malfunction choice that you made, and you now say it's God's timing. Sometimes the delay that we face and say it's God's timing could be maybe natural life process. Maybe you went for that interview and they did not give it to you. You say, it's God's timing, whereas you did not prepare well, or you are not fit for the job. I don't know if you're understanding me, guys. Now, back to God's timing. Let me give you examples of God's timing in the Bible. Remember that I've told you that God's timing simply means God accomplishing his purposes, his assignment in his own schedule, in his own time frame, in his own time, and not our time. So God's timing is not that God is doing everything we want. No, it simply means God is accomplishing his purpose at his own timing. Now, let me give you examples of God's timing in the Bible so you can understand. Number one example is Abraham. God promising Abraham a child, which is Isaac. But Abraham waited for so many years before Isaac could come forth. Another example is God promised the coming of a Messiah from the Old Testament, but we saw that centuries later, meaning centuries, 100 years, that means hundreds of years later, that was when Jesus came forth. And in Romans 5 verse 6, we see that Paul said Christ came at the right time. So it just simply means that this were God's time, this were God's own schedule, his own time frame for such purposes to be accomplished here on earth. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 says there is a time, which means an appointed time for everything. Biblically, God's timing simply means God actualizing or accomplishing his purposes at a time when he chooses. And God's time is not all about God doing everything that we want at the moment we want it. I don't know if you understand. It just simply means God actualizing his purposes at a time, at a schedule. He alone by himself chooses for it to happen at a time he appointed for that thing to do happen. And it has nothing to do with God doing everything we desire at the moment we want it or not at the moment we want it. Do you understand? Now, back to the difference between God's timing and the natural unfolding of life. There are two things involved. Some things are the normal unfolding of life. For example, you went to school. Within the 4 years or the 8 years that you are going to stay in that school, you will not say that is God's timing. It is the normal unfolding of life, that by you choosing that course, that is the number of years you're supposed to spend in school. You gain knowledge, you gain skill, you get pregnant in 9 months. You will not say that 9 months is God's timing. That is the normal time you're supposed to do what give birth. So these are natural unfolding of things that happen. Or you plant a seed and months later it begins to grow. So these are natural cause and effects. These are natural unfoldings of life. It has nothing to do with God's timing. These are natural unfoldings of life. Then the number two, you also have to understand that God can now still walk through that natural or ordinary unfolding of reality or life as it were to accomplish his purpose. For example, a perfect case scenario is the case of Joseph, where his brother sold him to Egypt and everything. Even when his brother sold him and he went through, God was still working through all of that process to still achieve the end purpose of Joseph becoming what the Bible made us to see that he become. So as Christians, a perfect or a balanced biblical understanding you need to have is that God works through the natural unfolding of life rather than against it. God will work through the natural. Maybe he has appointed that, oh, you will become so. He will work through the natural unfolding from you being a baby to you being an infant to a toddler, a teenager, an adult, you went to school. So God will be working through that natural unfolding of life to finally actualize his what purpose. Do you understand? Another balanced biblical perspective you need to also understand, like I've explained before, that it is unwise biblically and logically to call every delay or every harsh situation or consequence God's timing or God's will, because some things are only cause and effect, which means a reaction of an action that you made, a consequence of a decision that you made. Do you understand? For example, you went to steal and you got caught and people, they took you to the police. You will not call that God's timing. That was a reaction of an action that you made. So it is unwise to refer to every delay and harsh situation as God's timing, because sometimes we might be, like I've explained before, might be experiencing the consequence of our action. Sometimes we might be experiencing the outcome of other people's decision. Sometimes, because we live in a fallen world, bad things can happen. And sometimes it could be that maybe we need more preparation or more growth and more competence in that thing, and because of that we might be denied of it. So it doesn't mean that it is God's timing. It's just because you need more growth or you need more timing or more skill rather. Yet the scripture in Romans chapter 8 verse 28 teaches us that God, in him being sovereign, is able to weave in all of these natural cause and effects, all of this natural unfolding of lives, all the events. He's able to weave everything into accomplishing his purpose at his own schedule or timing. In summary, God's timing does not usually mean waiting for a magical moment. Rather, it means trusting on God that he can accomplish his purposes through both extraordinary intervention and also through the natural unfolding of life, often in ways we can only understand better later. Meaning that while God is doing all of this journey, you might not understand. That is why in that phase you are in your life now, you cannot add it up. It's not plusing, it's not minusing, it's not multiplying, anything you can say. But in retrospection, by the time God is done, in retrospection, you'll be able to understand, this is why God was taking me through this journey. A balanced biblical perspective is understanding. As a Christian, you need to understand that when we say God's timing, does not necessarily mean, or it doesn't usually mean waiting for a magical moment. No, it just simply means trusting on God, banking on him, that he being God, in him being sovereign, he can he can accomplish his purpose through extraordinary intervention and also through the natural unfolding of life. That you might not be able to understand at the moment it was happening, or you'll be able to understand what better later. Bye guys.